Farewell to Manzanar, Chapter 22, 10,000 Voices, page 167 to 176. As I came to understand what Manzanar had meant, it gradually filled me with shame for being a person guilty of something enormous enough to deserve that kind of treatment. In order to please my accusers, I tried for the first few years after our release to become someone acceptable. I both succeeded and failed. By the age of 17, I knew that making it, in the terms I had tried to adopt, was not only unlikely, but false and empty. No more authentic for me than trying to emulate my great-aunt Toyo. I needed some grounding of my own, such as Woody had found when he went to commune with her, and with our ancestors Keike. It took me another 20 years to accumulate the confidence to deal with what the equivalent experience would have to be for me. Page 168. It's outside the scope of this book to recount all that happened in the interim. Suffice to say, I was the first member of our family to finish college, and the first to marry out of my race. As my husband and I began to raise our family, and as I sought for ways to live agreeably in Anglo-American society, my memories of Manzanar, for many years, lived far below the surface. When we finally started to talk about making a trip to visit the ruins of the camp, something would inevitably get in the way of our plans. Mainly, my own doubts, my fears. I half suspected that the place did not exist. So few people I met in those years had even heard of it. And those who had knew so little about it, sometimes I imagined I had made the whole thing up, dreamed it. Even among my brothers and sisters, we seldom discussed the interment. If we spoke at all, we joked. When I think of how that secret lived in all our lives, I remember the way Kayo and I responded to a little incident soon after we got out of camp. We were sitting on a bus stop bench in Long Beach when an old, embittered woman stopped and said, "Why don't all you dirty Japs go back to Japan?" Wow. She spit at us and passed on. We said nothing at the time. After she stalked off down the sidewalk, we did not look at each other. We sat there for maybe 15 minutes with downcast eyes and finally got up and walked home. We couldn't bear to mention it to anyone in the family, and over the years we never spoke of this insult. It stayed alive in our separate memories, but it was too painful to call out into the open. Page 169. In 1966, I met a Caucasian woman who had worked for 1 year as a photographer at Manzanar. I could scarcely speak to her. I desperately wanted to, but all my questions stuck in my throat. This time it was not the pain of memory, it was simply her validation that all those things had taken place. Someone outside the close community of Japanese Americans had actually seen the camp, with its multitude of people and its swarm of buildings on the plain between the mountains. Something inside me opened then. I began to talk about it more and more. It was April 1972, 30 years almost to the day, that we piled our 3 kids into the car and headed out there. From where we live now, in the California coast town of Santa Cruz, it's a full day's drive. We started down 101 to Paso Robles, crossed over the Hummocky Diablo Range to the Central Valley, skirted Bakersfield, and climbed through Tehachapi Pass into the desert. At Mojave, we turned north onto the same road our bus had taken from Los Angeles in April 1942. It is the back road to the Sierras and the main route from Southern California to Reno and Lake Tahoe. We joined bikers and backpackers and skiers heading for Mammoth. The traffic through there is fast. Everyone but the bikers and backpackers and the skiers, everyone but the bikers making for the high country. As we sped along wide roads at 60 and 70 with our kids exclaiming at the sights we passed and our car loaded down with camping gear, it seemed even more, page 170, incredible to me that a place like Manzanar could have been anywhere within the reach of such a highway, such a caravan of pleasure-seeking travelers. The bikers peeled off at Red Rock Canyon, a gorgeous bulge of pink cliffs and rusty gulches humping out of the flat lands. After that, it was lovely desert, but nothing much to stop for. In 100 miles, we passed 2 oases. The first at Olancha, the second around Lone Pine, a small tree-filled town where a lot of mountain buffs turn off the Mount Whitney portal. A few miles out of the Lone Pine, we started looking for another stand of trees, some tall elms, and what remains of those gnarled pear orchards. They were easy to spot. Everything else is sagebrush, tumbleweeds, and wind. At its peak in the summer of '42, Manzanar was the biggest city between Reno and Los Angeles, a special kind of western boomtown that sprang from the sand, flourished, had its day, and now has all but disappeared. The barracks are gone, torn down right after the war. The guard towers are gone, and the mess halls and shower rooms, the hospital, the tea gardens, and the white buildings outside the compound. Even the dust is gone. Spreading brush holds it to the ground. 30 years earlier, Army bulldozers had scraped everything clean to construction. What you see from the road are 2 gatehouses, each a small empty pillbox of a building faced with flagstones and topped like tiny pagodas with shingled curving roofs. Farther in, you see the elms, most of which were planted by internees, and off to the right a large green building that was once our high school auditorium, now a maintenance depot for the Los Angeles Power and Water District, who leased the land to the government during the war and still owns it. Past the gatehouses, we turned left over a cattle guard and onto a dirt perimeter road that led to the far side of the campsite. About a half a mile in, we spotted a white obelisk gleaming in the distance and marking a subtle line where the plain begins gradually to slope upward into the alluvial fan that becomes the base of the mountains. It seemed miraculous, as if some block of stone had fallen from the peaks above and landed upright in the bush, chiseled, solitary, 12 feet high. Near it, a dozen graves were outlined in the sand with small stones, and a barbed wire fence surrounded them to keep back the cattle and the tumbleweed. The black Japanese script cut into the white face of the obelisk read simply, "A memorial to the dead." We were alone out there, too far from the road to hear anything but the wind. I thought of Mama, now 7 years gone. For a long time I stood gazing at the monument. I couldn't step inside the fence. I believe in ghosts and spirits. I knew I was in the presence of those who had died at Manzanar. I also felt the spiritual presence that always lingers near awesome wonders, page 172, like Mount Whitney. Then, as if rising from the ground around us on the valley floor, I began to hear the first whispers, nearly inaudible, from all those thousands who had once lived out here, a wide, windy sound of the ghost of that life. As we began to walk, it grew to a murmur, a thin, steady hum. We turned the kids loose, watched them scamper off ahead of us, and we followed what used to be an asphalt road running from the back side of the camp a mile out to the highway. The obelisk, built in 1943, and the gatehouses are all that survived intact from internment days. The rest of the place looked devastated by a bombing raid. The old road was disintegrating, split, weed-sprung. We poked through the remains of hospital foundations, undermined by erosion channels. We found concrete slabs where the latrines and shower rooms stood, and irrigation ditches, and here and there the small rock arrangements that once decorated many of the entranceways. I had found out that even in North Dakota, when Papa and the other Isai men imprisoned there had free time, they would gather small stones from the plain and spend hours sorting through a dry stream bed, looking for the veined or polished rock that somehow pleased the most. It is so characteristically Japanese. the way lives were made more tolerable by gathering loose desert stones and forming with them something endearingly human. These rock gardens had outlived the barracks and the towers, and would surely outlive the asphalt road and rusted pipes and shattered slabs of concrete. Page 173. Each stone was a mouth speaking for a family, for some man who had beautified his doorstep. Vegetation gets thickest toward the center of the site, where the judo pavilion once stood and where rows of elms planted at windbreaks have tripled their growth since the 40s. And there we came across the remains of a small park. A stone-lined path ran along the base of a broad mound of dirt, about 5 feet high. Stones had been arranged on the mound, and some low trees still shaded it and made an arch above the path. For a moment I was strolling again, finding childish comfort in its incongruous design. But after 10 feet the path ended in tumbleweeds. The trees were dry and stubby, the mound was barren, and my attention was arrested by a water faucet sticking 2 feet out of the sand, like some subterranean periscope. One of these had provided water for each barracks. They stuck up at intervals in every direction, strangely sharpening the loneliness and desolation, sometimes the only sign of human presence in an acre or two of sand. My mood had shifted. The murmur turned to wind. For a while I could almost detach myself from the place and its history, and take pleasure in it purely as an archaeological site. I saw the outlines, patterns the city must have taken. I imagined where the building stood, almost as I once did nosing around old Roman villas in Europe. Page 174. We saw a lot of low ring. We saw a low ring of stones built up with cement, and wondered who the mason was, who knelt there, and studied the shapes before fitting them together. We moved around the ring a few feet to find out. This was the old flagpole circle, where the stars and stripes were hoisted every morning, and the inscription scratched across the top said, "Built by Wada and crew, June 10th, 1942 A.D." The A.D. made me shiver. I knew that the man who inscribed it had foreseen these ruins and did not want his masonry identified with the wrong era. His words coming out of the stone became a voice that emerged with all the others, not a murmur this time, but low voices muttering and chattering all around me. We were crossing what used to be fire break, now a sandy field devoid of any growth. The wind was vicious there, with nothing to break it, and the voices grew. The fire break was where we had talent shows and dances and outdoor movies in the summer, and where the kids played games. I heard the girls' glee club I used to sing in, way off from the other side of the camp. Way off from the other side of the camp. Their tiny grade school sopranos singing, "Beautiful dreamer, wake unto me." I closed my eyes and I was 10 years old again. Nothing had changed. I heard laughter. It was almost dusk. The wind had stopped and I saw old men squatting in the dirt. Papa and some of his old cronies, muttering and smoking cigarettes. In the summertime, they used to burn orange peels under gallon cans, with holes punched in the side to keep the mosquitoes away. Sometimes they would bring out their boards to play Gosh and Hannah. The orange peels would smolder in there, and the men would hunker down around the cans and watch the smoke seep out the holes. From that fire break, we cut across toward the first row of pear trees, looking for what might remain of Block 28. There wasn't much to guide us, but the trees themselves and a view I remembered of the blunt, bulky Inyo Range that bounds the eastern limit of the valley. When we were close enough to smell the trees, we stopped. They were stunted, tenacious, tough the way a cactus has to be. The water table in that one area has kept them living through all those years of neglect. And they were ready to bloom at any moment. The heady smell was as odd in that desert setting as the little scrap of park had been. As odd, yet just as familiar. We used to picnic there in blossom time on weekends if we got a wind-free day. The wind blew it toward us now, chilled pear nectar, and it blew our kids around a high stand of brush. They came tumbling across the sand, demanding to know what we were going to do out here. Our twins were 5 years old at the time, a boy and a girl. Our older daughter had just turned 11. She knew about the evacuation, but it would be a few more years before she absorbed this part of the family history. For these three, the site had been like any wreck or ruin. Page 176, our last page. They became explorers, rushed around, hoping the next clump of dusty trees or chunk of wall might reveal the treasure, the trinket, the exotically rusted hinge. Nothing much had turned up. The shine was wearing off the trip. Their eyes were red and their faces badly chapped. No place for kids. My husband started walking them back to the car. I stayed behind a moment longer, first watching our 11-year-old stride ahead, leading her brother and sister. She has long, dark hair like mine, and was then the same age I had been when the camp closed. It was so simple, watching her, to see why everything that had happened to me since we left camp referred back to it in one way or another. At that age, your body is changing. Your imagination is galloping. Your mind is in that zone between a child's vision and an adult's. Papa's life ended at Manzanar, though he lived for 12 more years after getting out. Until this trip, I had not been able to admit that my own life really began there. The times I thought I had dreamed it were one way of getting rid of it. Part of wanting to lose it, part of what you might call a whole Manzanar mentality I had lived with for 25 years. Much more than a remembered place, it had become a state of mind. Now, having seen it, I no longer wanted to lose it or to have those years erased. Having found it, I could say what you can only say when you've truly come to know a place. Farewell.